Welcome to today's Harvard Business Review webinar, How to Create a Digital Workplace. I'm Angela Herron, editor of Special Projects and Research at HBR, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And I want to thank BMC for making this discussion possible. There's a lot of conversation today about the digital workplace, but how can organizations create a human-centered digital workplace that is a sustainable proposition and a competitive advantage? In working with hundreds of companies, Paul Miller, who's the CEO and founder of the Digital Workplace Group, has found that all too often companies focus on technology rather than on employees' experiences when moving to the digital workplace. That can create resistance, and ultimately it can fail to gain the benefits that the technologies were designed to create. Paul is here with us today to talk about the practical steps that companies can take to create a truly productive digital workplace and share insights from his experiences and best practices in making productive digital workplaces a reality. Paul, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome, and it's great to be here, Angela.
Paul, as we get started, as I mentioned in my introduction, people often do face some resistance from employees when they're first introduced to the idea of the digital workplace. Is that just because the terminology itself sort of reflects some kind of a technological bias and maybe sounds robotic to people?
Yeah, no, I think there's probably a couple of reasons. One is I think there's a sort of generalized fear in our society, really, that technology is going to sort of take away from the physical or human contact between us. So if we become more digital, will we become less physical? Will we become less human in our interactions? So I think there's a kind of technology fear about it. But one of the things that I often say to people is that the digital workplace is not a new experience. I believe that it started in the mid-1800s with the first intercompany phone call. So if I was in one company and you were in another company and we had a phone call, we weren't physically together, but we were communicating, and we were communicating in what I think was the first sign of the digital workplace. So, and thank you very much for the introduction. So, how do we go about setting up a digital workplace program? And what I want to take us through today is a checklist which is designed to bring some success. Just briefly to explain that the company that I run, the Digital Workplace Group, has two aspects to our work. We have a member forum where we create peer conversations amongst major organizations around the world, and a consulting practice, and I've written a number of books in the field. Just to kind of start off, the illustrations and how-to guide that I'm hoping to take you through today is based on a lot of in-depth research that the Digital Workplace Group has done. It's through 100 detailed research case studies from organizations like IKEA, Bank of New York Mellon, Swedish government interviews. We've also carried out more than 700 benchmarks, originally of intranets, and then in the last 5 years of the broader digital worlds of work inside organizations. And we've done that with about 150 organizations. I mention this just to show you that the approaches that we've developed are based on research and data. And I often talk about data and metrics in a world of opinion. So we have to start by a definition of the digital workplace. And it's a term that I started using in about 2009. And I really was saying that there is a physical world of work, and the counterpoint to that is the digital world of work. So essentially everywhere that we work that isn't physical is digital. So, for example, this entire experience, irrespective of where we all are, and the people tuning in will be around the world, and then there's a group of people who then listen and watch this later, that this is all happening in the digital workplace, partly inside the organization and partly externally. The definition that got used in the book that I co-authored with our Director of Research, Elizabeth Marsh, digital renaissance. So the digital workplace is the collection of all the digital tools provided by an organization that allows employees to do their jobs. And there's a number of different definitions, but I think it gets to the idea. It's that whole raft of technology. It's intranet, HR systems, audio conferencing, video conferencing, collaborative forums, SharePoint, mobile deployments, etc. And that, if you like, are all the constituent parts of this constantly evolving digital world of work. There's a few little sort of aphorisms around the side there that I think we're probably familiar with, that the work is not a destination. So my mother is 95 today, which is, I was thinking, so she was born in 1921, and when she started off, work would have been a place you went to. And for most of her life, work has been a place you go to. It's no longer a destination. It's an experience. We're all joining this work conversation, if you like, from wherever we are, but we're not at a physical destination. There's also this notion of work and life blending. And I think that's about the kind of portability and flexibility that the digital workplace brings. Measured by output, not presence, and that's something that we certainly practice within the Digital Workplace Group, where we have 80 people working across the world in a fully distributed, brackets, no offices organization, and you're judging people based on what they produce rather than what they input. There's a digital environment of work that is not physical. That's part of the digital workplace. And as I said before, when you go back to the first inter-company phone call, every organization, whether they have a digital workplace they're proud of or one that they're embarrassed by, every organization does have one. Another aspect of this is that the intranet is often seen as a front door into the digital workplace. We're doing work with a large international part of the UN responsible for refugees around the world, and they're seeing their intranet as the front door into the digital workplace, whether people are in head offices or distributed around the world trying to help people who are suffering. And then the final point is the digital work ethic, and this is an interesting aspect to the digital workplace, which is, I think it's enabling us to move from a Protestant work ethic, work as suffering, duty and obligation, to a digital work ethic, which is work as passion, fulfillment and enjoyment. It's not that everybody's work has become like that, but it's on that continuum. So why do this in the first place? Well, there are benefits of a good digital workplace, and the benefits are listed out there: cost optimization, productivity, business continuity, corporate and social responsibility, increased revenue. And just a few examples, Barclays introduced their MyZone application for their frontline staff a couple of years ago, and that resulted in a 50% decline in customer complaints about staff knowledge, like a dramatic improvement. PwC reported $1 million of savings annually from introducing a single collaboration platform and shutting down other applications. UniCredit in Italy reduced by 67% the time employees take to find information by taking a user-centered design approach. And Eli Lilly, through using innovation jams, collaborative conversations online, through one idea for an innovative packaging approach, brought in $14 million of savings. So the benefits are very strong. I think just as importantly, the costs that come from a poor digital workplace are there in terms of loss of productivity, duplication of systems, duplication of data, reduced adoption of services, just kind of employee frustration, which I sometimes call as digital disappointment. You fire up the technology and your heart sinks. And that's certainly true for organizations where people join them because they've got a fantastic brand, and then the technology lets them down. The other cost is a reduced ability to attract and retain talent. And in the Conference Board's survey of CEOs in 2016, the attraction and retaining of talent has become one of the two top CEO issues. So I think that's a really important one. And increased risk. Few examples. High-skilled workers spend around 28% of their time managing email, according to a recent survey by McKinsey. Managers are spending around 2 hours a day searching and 50% for content that they find of no value. That's from Accenture. Ineffective use of email can cost around about $6,000 a year per employee, according to a survey from Mesmo. And every time an employee has to switch task, and I picked this up from listening to a really excellent HBR IdeaCast on, I think the subject was collaboration overload, was that every time you switch from one task to another, it takes you 65 seconds to readjust. So I think those are some of the examples of why putting some attention into the digital workplace is important. Something that I want to share is this digital workplace checklist. So this is a checklist that you can use to set up or improve your digital workplace program, and it's downloadable from the link there. The areas that we look at, which I'll go through, are strategy and approach, stakeholders and buy-in, governance framework, and implementation and measurement. By strategy and approach, I mean the overarching vision and scope and the alignment with the organization and business goals. In terms of stakeholders and buy-in, who will lead the digital workplace effort, which is often a conversation that organizations struggle with. Which stakeholders need to be involved? And thinking about culture and work styles. Then by governance, I mean the overall policy management, and it's really critical to get that right, because as the digital workplace expands, your governance needs to be able to include that. And what does it take to implement successful governance? And then under implementation and measurement, it's really about understanding what we call organizational digital readiness and the importance of change management and taking a data-driven approach. Too often, the approach that's taken is, and I was talking to an organization, a financial services company yesterday, and they were saying, the technology, in that case it was Jive, has been fired up and it's all working, but nobody's really sure what they're supposed to be doing with it. They're not sure what the usage is. They're not sure what the adoption is, and that's because there's often an awful lot of attention focused on the technology working rather than the underpinning change management. So start off with the first part of the checklist is around strategy and approach. And this is really so defining the scope of the digital workplace, what tools and services and applications. For instance, are you going to be looking at just the employee population, or are you going to include contractors, freelancers in the organization? Are you going to go out into the distribution network and partners and so on? And the next part of that is about defining the vision and strategy. This is really critical. I was with an organization in the US where we had a member meeting last week, and some of their capability around the digital workplace was really terrific. The ability to easily and effortlessly enter any of the buildings with a single identity, and to have the system recognize you when you move into conference rooms. And they were doing some really interesting things, but they said what they really lacked was a clear strategic vision and roadmap. And I think it's so essential to have that. The next part of this is to review the current strategy and roadmaps and to ensure that there's their realignment to the overall digital workplace strategy, and then socializing the concept. When we asked DWG members if they have a digital workplace program, we do an annual survey. At the end of 2015, 23% said that they did have a digital workplace program, And we're seeing in our digital maturity benchmark that the digital workplace needs a much greater level of strategic awareness and priority. So those are some of the points that you really need to think about under strategy and approach. And just to put a little bit more detail on this, there's different ways of thinking of the digital workplace, but the digital workplace can seem quite overwhelming, and you said that in your initial question, Angela. But when you're getting, where do you start? Well, many people are starting to choose to start with the front door to the digital workplace through their intranet. And it's not that intranets have been removed or replaced. It's often about having other aspects of the wider digital ecosystem surrounding them. So if you're thinking about this, it's often a good way to think about it as an intranet-driven digital workplace. And we've seen that at Coca-Cola, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Estee Lauder, Northwestern Mutual, who started with that approach. Others are approaching the digital workplace as part of a bigger transformation, so tying it into a agile working program or thinking about focusing on employee experience. So there can be other initiatives that are happening inside the organization. Going back a few years, it was often connected with changes to offices, so the physical offices, and let's tie our digital workplace into the fact there's going to be less physical real estate for people to use. But I think there's some really interesting approaches around having what I call a human-centered or employee-centered digital workplace, and we're seeing that at Bank of New York Mellon and IKEA. And at Bank of New York Mellon, they're really experimenting thanks to their very progressive CIO. They're kind of experimenting with subjects like working out loud and really creating a more open culture inside the organization. So those are some of the aspects of that. Also under strategy and approach, as I said, our kind of heritage is in the field of intranet, and we've moved from there into the wider digital workplace. We do a analysis of different approaches that people take, and we chart how they're performing in terms of capability across a whole number of different metrics. So we look at communication and business intelligence, collaboration and community, services and workflow, structure and coherence, mobility and flexibility, strategic alignment and management, and organizational readiness. And we really look to see where they are in terms of their maturity. And what's interesting is that strategic management has typically been a weak area in intranet management, and is also when performing in the same way when we look at the digital workplace. And we can see that organizational readiness is generally either mid or below. So there's this lack of what you might think of as digital literacy inside the organization, and improving the digital literacy, which is something that organizations like Verizon have been looking at, Barclays have been doing a great deal of work on. And it's interesting when you're starting to think about your digital workplace to try and get a kind of baseline where we are. I think quite often people feel or fear that they might be at a base level in all of these things. That they won't be. You can see that services and workflow is generally quite a good performing area. Communication and business intelligence, not so bad. And that's a useful way of plotting it. And as I say, different organizations approach the digital workplace through different lenses. So this is an example from Unilever, and they approached it through their agile working program. And agile was affecting their workplaces, their technology, their working practices, talent, recruitment, and so on. And they really looked at the whole idea of capability They said we need to improve our digital workplace to improve the capability, allowing Unilever employees to do their jobs better by giving them the tools they needed to do the job. They've had a huge focus around sustainability as a business through their CEO, Paul Polman, and he saw the reduction of travel as being a critical value add from the digital workplace, as well as the reduction in real estate, which we're seeing across all organizations. And then this vitality area I think is interesting. If you can engage people more, use aspects of what is called gamification, the idea of trying to create some competitive appetite inside the organization, you can improve people's engagement. And I think also the flexibility to do with people's working schedules. I rather like the fact that at Google now they are less fixated on people coming into a single office each day, but what they're saying is that if teams are working on a project together, they need to be able to come together physically if they need to. So that sort of, for me, means you need to live within, say, a 25-mile radius of the office, but it gives people options as to where they're going to work within that. So it's interesting to think and try and see whether the digital workplace program fits with other initiatives within your organization. The second area to focus on is looking at stakeholders and buy-in. And this is a very kind of fraught area for organizations. And I think one of the reasons is traditionally the stakeholders who you need to have involved don't usually work together on cross-business projects like this. So a digital workplace will affect facilities, HR, technology, communication. In the case of IKEA, they also involve all the people responsible for travel and meetings. So trying to get those stakeholders aligned is really key. And it really starts off by identifying the senior sponsor. If I look at Barclays, if I look at BNY Mellon, if I look at Verizon, IKEA, what you see is the ownership is right at the most senior C-suite level. It doesn't necessarily have to be the CEO. It could be the CIO or the CTO, but you need somebody who sees this as business critical to the organization. So identification of the senior sponsor, then identifying the key stakeholders, and this is often done kind of in retrospect. The technology leads, the technology needs to fire up, and then all of a sudden these other people from facilities, real estate, HR, travel, corporate communications pop up and say, well, what about me? Where are we in this? So get these people aligned in a steering group, as a strategic group from the beginning. Another sort of part of this, which I often say, is that don't see the digital workplace improvement as a project, see it as a program. Think of this a bit like the physical workplace of your organization. So just like the physical workplace of the organization is an ongoing maintenance and improvement activity for your organization, so think of the digital worlds that we work in the same way. The next point is to identify current business and system stakeholders for the tools and scope of the program, and undertake internal and external research to capture insights from the various different groups in order that you're shaping something based on those needs. And if I look at the organizations, take Barclays as an example, and they wanted to, post-2008, really digitally transform the reputation of the organization. And so they deployed the largest number of iPads that had ever been bought at that time, 11,000, distributed them to people throughout their retail network, created the MyZone application, motivated engagement through this program, which they called their Digital Eagles, which were younger, digitally savvy people inside the organization who'd become the ambassadors and the evangelists. That group of people then started not only training people inside Barclays, but they started training customers in digital literacy. And now, amazingly, they're actually allowing non-Barclays customers to come into any of their retail branches and to get trained in how to use Skype, how to use Instagram, different technologies, because they're trying to raise the digital IQ of the markets that they operate in. So stakeholders and buy-in is really key. And one of the as you can see in this slide here, 83% of digital workplace programs have senior leadership involvement. And other key stakeholders are listed there. It's not really critical as to where the digital workplace should be led from. The important thing is that it is properly led. As you can see, it's split between IT, communications, marketing, or specific digital workplace functions or HR. McKinsey found that across the C-suite, more than ever before, senior executives are getting involved in digital initiatives, and they found that 31% of organizations they surveyed, the CEO personally sponsors these initiatives, and this tallies with what we found in our research. So there is growing interest, commitment at senior levels to transform the business, to streamline processes, to enable geographically dispersed terms, and particularly an issue that I find really energizes people is capturing the hearts and minds of the younger demographics. So we're fixated on the millennials today, but what about the 12 and 13-year-olds, this next wave that are going to follow on and come into the world of work in 5 or 6 years' time is not very long, and they're probably going to kind of knock the socks off the millennials and make them feel like they kind of missed out. So we're seeing the emergence of chief digital officers, directors of strategic transformation, or this other title, which is Chief Employee Experience Officer. HSBC have one, Airbnb have one, and I think it's interesting to track the digital workplace through the experience of people. An example of stakeholders and buy-in and senior leadership is from Deutsche Telekom, Tim Hodges, who's the CEO there. They're a global telecoms company with 90,000 employees. They recently introduced a highly active social platform called the Telecom Social Network to help connect the organizations. Before that, it was very hard for employees to interact with senior management. And we see this a lot where people feel the senior management are a little bit invisible because they're not digitally present inside the organization. So Tim Hodges has created a channel called TimSpace. He allows any employee to ask a question or initiate a discussion on any topic they like. One of the things that I love about this is that it's persistent, 24/7. You can jump onto TimSpace and you can post a question. You won't get an immediate answer necessarily. You won't actually necessarily get your particular question answered if it's not appropriate for him to answer it. He'll pass it on. But the point is the channel of communication is open. And there's a very high level of interaction there with 7,000 employees joining in it, and there are no topics off limits. And I really think that raises the trust and ownership inside the organization. Again, looking at the stakeholder buy-in, one of the things we've started tracking is digital culture and looking at where are you on 13 different cultural values, which you can see listed there. And we look also through different work styles. And it's really a way of trying to understand which cultural values, let's say it's individualism. So that might well be an enabler inside your organization, but it also might be something that is preventing greater levels of teamwork. So it's very interesting to try and get a fix on your digital culture as it stands at the moment. For example, at Sprint, the evolution of their digital workplaces has reflected the changing culture of the organization. They redesigned their social collaboration and really saw a culture shift towards greater openness through that. So the next area that I'd like to cover, and we've looked at two of the parts, the first part around strategy, stakeholder and vision. So we're now looking at this topic of the governance framework. So as I referred to before, establish a digital workplace steering group and working groups under that. Define the roles and responsibilities. Get your thinking, get your planning right. There's one organization that we've been working with in the US, Financial Services, and they're looking at the Workplace 2025. And so it's you can't know exactly what all the steps are going to be in a world increasingly imbued with smart machines, artificial intelligence, but start to have a plan. I spoke to somebody at a Swedish company yesterday, and she was very frustrated. She said she was running the digital workplace inside the program, and she said she can't quite understand why so many people are surprised that she's got a 5-year plan for this, with stages along the way. But that's what it needs. Review your existing policies, define the governance that you want, define standards. We probably all know instances where people are throwing up different applications inside the organization. And Kevin Olp, who runs a digital workplace at Northwestern Mutual, started talking about the digital workplace as a platform inside Northwestern Mutual. And you can do whatever you want, but it has to meet the standards of our digital workplace platform. So it's about giving people latitude, but not so much latitude that they can kind of just go off and do their own thing. And liaise with procurement to establish the process and checkpoints for new applications. In terms of governance framework, and this comes out partly from our work in intranets and beyond that, there's a strong link, as you can see at the top right-hand corner, but it's likely to be causal from intranet governance to key areas of intranet performance. But in 24% of the organizations that we surveyed, they had robust strategic level governance compared to 45% for operational governance. So it's less around, they were less advanced in terms of strategy. And that's based on analysis that we've done of the 700 and more benchmarks. There's a strong link between governance and performance. Nationwide, who are financial services, sort of mutual, I think you'd probably call them in the UK, recently launched their new digital workplace environment, and they put a lot of accent at the beginning on governance. And in our benchmarking, it meant that they were able to really move up the league table substantially through that. So when you're thinking about the governance framework, the areas to think about are operational, technical, and the other items listed there. And effective governance is really critical for this. So if you're looking at operational, think about ownership, think about implementation, stewardship, and process. And research that we've done has looked at what it takes to get governance right across the whole digital workplace. And we looked at IKEA, Bank of New York, Mellon, Scottish Government, and Swisscom. So quite a range of organizations. And these were the elements that we saw. And I think that's what's needed to develop a sustainable employee experience. So the final part here is around implementation and measurement. And the areas to focus on here, and this is the fourth of the areas that are in the checklist, is determining your approach for rollout of the services and applications, engaging the change management team or creating a change management team that runs alongside the program. It's really a kind of essential because the main reasons for success will be cultural, behavioral, and to do with change management. I think increasingly the technology just works. Yes, it needs configuring. Yes, it needs implementing. But increasingly, it's a hygiene factor, whether you're using SharePoint, Slack, Jive, Facebook at work, whatever it might be, different applications. But the change management and the culture and behavior will be key. establish delivery teams and local buy-in from implementation. And I had a great example a few days ago when somebody said that their new collaborative environment on Jive had been deployed inside the organization, and she was a key communicator inside this retail organization, and she said she was completely in the dark as to what was being expected of her. And it's really, people like that are a key resource in organizations, and too often they're only thought about once the technology's gone live and the questions start to come in. And the next point is to establish success criteria, key performance indicators and metrics. Don't have too many, but do make sure that you have a number of them that really matter and fit with your organization. So, and when we analyzed the benchmarking that we did last year, we found that one area that really stood out was this area of organizational change and culture, which is why I'm emphasizing it. And it really correlates with performance in more than 10 other areas. So, it's really a linchpin, and this is based on benchmarking that we've been doing over the last 14 years. And the area is a proxy for how determined an organization truly is to improve their digital workplace. I think if it's something that your organization's neglecting or saying, yeah, well, we'll tack in a little bit of culture change and, everybody will be nice and happy, then that you're serious about getting the technology right, but you're not serious about really changing the way the company worked. So we've looked at this in our culture research, and the findings are that the understanding the culture is a prerequisite to bring the organization to where you want it to be. And at a pharmaceutical company based in Switzerland, they really were impressed that their senior management and the C-suite had really understand the relationship between engagement and employee engagement and profitability for the organization. Just to give you an example of what some of the practice can look like when it's implemented, this is PwC's global network. They've got around about 195,000 staff, increasing pressure for large global clients to have joined-up services across different countries, and it's a case study featured in the Digital Renaissance book. So they invested in a global social collaboration platform called Spark. It's based on Jive. It's got a high level of adoption with communities across the network and in individual countries. And in 89 countries that participated, some of them were at near 100% adoption. And when we last tracked this, admittedly it's about a year ago, the overall adoptions was standing at 80%, with 65% of people logging in more than once every 30 days. They did give local firms autonomy on how to use and launch Spark, and so they had then a sense of ownership. That has been critical. And they have a global network of 1,200 enthusiastic users as local advocates. Just keep in mind that Barclays example and the 20 did original, what they call digital eagles or digital evangelists. They eventually became 3,000, and you're tapping into this latent resource inside your organization. So how do you know if your digital workplace is any good and if it's improving? Well, leading organizations like Bank of New York Mellon are taking an iterative, data-driven approach to it, developing a holistic set of measures to understand the digital workplace on expected benefits. Some of these are some of the benefit areas. It ties to what I said before: cost optimization, reduced technology costs, employee debt ratio, reduce support costs, lower infrastructure costs on real estate, reduce business mileage, people and productivity, looking at the adoption rates and engagement scores. So if engagement drives productivity and you're doing annual surveys of your employee engagement, looking at that. Time that people take to find information, reduce time to find things. So why invest in search? Because you can get to what you're finding quicker. Business continuity, weather events, global events, We live in a kind of increasingly fragile world, and if you can carry on working when the office environments are not available, then you can keep the productivity going. Corporate social responsibility, increasingly important, falling greenhouse gas emissions, energy costs, business travel miles, etc. And then increased revenue, increased sales. Vodafone are using their improved digital workplace and to really bring richer content to their very distributed sales force, and then accelerating innovation through jams like the one that I mentioned earlier. So the digital workplace checklist, which you'll see here, covers these aspects of strategy and approach, stakeholders and buy-in, governance and framework, implementation and measurement. And as I say, it's downloadable there. Just to kind of say, and this comes at home to me time and again, getting this stuff right is hard work. You will suffer as you're doing it. You will find it hard to arrange all the different stakeholders. However, it is worth it when you get there, because improving the capability of the organization through the digital workplace and really making yourself, if you like, the digital world of work ready for the future is work worth doing. So with that, I will hand back to you, Angela.
Oh, thank you so much. There's so many good questions here. I'm trying to decide where to jump in. So I think I'll jump in kind of at the beginning, as you described, as a company prepares to launch such a project. Because someone asked, well, could you talk a little bit more about who's there at the beginning as far as in terms of governance? Or do you think about this in terms of putting together a committee of people? Do you let one group lead the charge? Can you talk a little bit about how you set that up? And second part of that question is, does some of the rules of the road morph as people begin to see what they're doing?
Well, just to pick up the first question on governance, there isn't a one way of doing it that works, but there needs to be some level of C-level sponsorship and endorsement for the entire program, for the fact that improving the way that the organization works digitally internally matters, and ideally this should be shared across the C-suite. Then I've seen organizations where the chief financial officer or somebody reporting into them will head up a steering group, or it could be located within HR, it could be located within the CIO office. So who's chairing that doesn't matter, but what does matter is that you get these different stakeholders that I've mentioned, that you have obviously technology, but you also have all the people responsible for real estate, that you have HR, that you have communications, that you ideally have people responsible for digital innovation inside the organization, and set the kind of group quite widely as to anybody who's going to be affected. Let's say you're in an organization like DHL, you might want to make sure that specific representation around warehousing or transportation represented there. So spending some time to make sure you get that right, and just that that group before you've even moved on to, so what technology are we going to have and when are we going to have it, is really key. Could you just give me the second question again on the rules of the that you actually...
Yeah, and I think the point here was the person was making the point that you can agree on the reason why you want to do this. You can take an inventory and decide what technologies you really want to focus on are most important, what you have in-house and what you need to bring in. But then once you have the technology and the rules, they're making the point, well, does it sometimes fall down when they start communicating it to the general populace, and people say, well, that's great, except that actually that doesn't really work for us. I mean, do you find that people, they modify and morph this as the process goes along, or is it more a matter of saying, here's the rules, here's why, here's how to use them?
Well, I think at an overall strategic level, it's important to set the ground rules. Let's say as an organization you're involved in retail, And you say that we want to make sure that we've got a seamless experience across the organization, that people can track inventory across the organization, that we want people in our retail outlets to have a more mobile experience rather than just be standing behind a counter, that we want to bring iPads. So that's an overall strategy to do with the experience. However, the bit where you need to factor into the development stage of the program is what kind of applications in the stores, in the warehouses, in the manufacturing side are people going to be able to use? And that's all about this whole area of user-centered design. So if what you're deploying is something that doesn't have that engagement with some representative sample of the different groups inside the organization who are going to be using the technology, then when you deploy the new services, you're going to find that there's an awful lot of wasted time. It would be the equivalent of kind of building a new car essentially without actually doing enough research with the actual customers as to what features are going to really matter, and testing. So I don't think you want a kind of consensus-driven approach across the whole organization. Set the key parameters, but do make sure that you work in an iterative process. I mean, learn from what the large technology companies do, which is they're constantly, Facebook's going to decide to roll out some tiny little change to its feature set. It will test that rigorously with different groups and in different instances before it does so. And we really need to learn from that kind of mindset.
Lots of questions about culture shift and what culture challenges that an implementation faces. So first question, do you find that different cultures really kind of demand different kinds of rollouts? Some people are just more ready, or the culture may be in a different of a style differently than another one?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because there's culture in a number of different levels. There's the whole nature of how digitally literate different groups are. There's also and it's somewhat related to this, but the wider demographic inside the organization, so you can have several generations. And then in a global organization, you can have different geographical cultures. Just on the kind of geographical cultures, it appears that the differences are really quite minor between different groups. You might find in somewhere like in India, in the Indian subcontinent, you'll get very, very high participation in collaborative tools, and you'll get less of that in the Far East. But you'll still get participation. I think being mindful of the levels of digital literacy and starting to, in a way, have a program like Barclays have had, where you're using this, if you like, reverse mentoring and this group of evangelists inside the organization to improve the literacy skills, is something that can benefit all types of people inside the organization. But let's face it, we're all getting sort of trained on a daily basis in our consumer life in how to use tools. So I think it's a question of being less mindful of the kind of cultural variations, and just making sure that you're giving people the right level of support, really.
So, which leads me to another question. A lot of people liked your KPIs and measurement charts, because they were curious to know how to understand the productivity. But there was also some questions about the chart that talks about the benefit areas, where we talk about how the company benefits from cost optimization and productivity and accelerating innovation. But several people ask, well, what about the question to the individual, which is, what's in it for me? Because people are going to face some changes, some people more than others, on how they work. So can you talk a little bit about how you've seen companies be successful about communicating that in an individual way? Do they tailor messages, or how do they go about this?
Well, I think a good example is there's a company called Addison Lee, which runs a very, very well-run private hire car service in London, and they introduced some really smart applications into their digital workplace. And one of the things it did was allow people who were in the kind of back office areas for Addison Lee to work from home if they want to, rather than work in specific offices. So that's a way of thinking about a potential benefit for people. I've seen within Hein Brothers, which is a coffee chain based in Kentucky, they were finding it very difficult to reach hourly paid workers, younger people inside the retail outlets. So they developed an app, very consumer friendly app that would come to people's phones, irrespective of what device they were using, and they got very high levels of participation. People were notified when they were being paid. So, you know, the story for both of those groups is there's a benefit for you. So I think it's a question of thinking about how the better use of technology, whether it's more flexible working, different kind of shift patterns, mobile, or in the case of, you take the example with Barclays and all the 11,000 iPads, you know, the advantage, the question was, well, what's in it for me? Well, you can set up customers in the branch. And this is going back 3 years. It's now a little bit more standard. You can kind of flip out their phone with them, and you can get them using all the different applications. So your experience moves from being somebody who's behind a screen serving people to being a, if you like, socializer, an educator within the branch. But I think it's a really good question, and I'm going to add that to the benefits chart, is to think about what the kind of what's in it for me on an individual level.
Someone else just commented, well, you know, I think that the problem for some folks is that they fear that the creation of a digital workplace means they can never leave work. Have you ever heard people say that, since it's ever with you if you're truly a digital workplace?
Yeah, this is one of the sort of hot topics, and that's really for me about management and leadership. I mean, one of the things that I experienced recently, there's only 80 people in the digital workplace group, but I never used to work evenings or weekends, and then to do with kind of just changes in my kind of pattern of living and working, I decided sometimes I would, and I basically blogged about the fact that you shouldn't ape the CEO just because that's the way somebody's working. Don't kind of think that's what you need to do. And I think it's about setting expectations inside the organization. I think, yes, it does mean that people can access work, and there's always that, classic thing, if my boss emails me at 10 o'clock at night, am I expected to reply at 10:30, at night as well? And that's about management. I think the point is, yes, you can email late at night, or you can put it on a time delay if it's sending the wrong message inside the organization. I think we're all having in our lives generally to develop what you might think of as sort of digital living discipline, really. Digital detoxing. When do we switch off? What's acceptable policy? So we're at the early stages of this. And just remember, the Industrial Revolution's been around for 200 years. So where we are still predominantly is in the post-industrial revolution world, and where we are right at the sort of early stages are as the digital revolution. So, it's a little bit clunky, it's a little bit clumsy, it doesn't connect as well as it might, and sometimes we can binge work, which is not a good thing, and it's we need to develop the disciplines.
Do you find that some companies have actually put out rules of engagement to say this is what our protocol is for when we will and won't respond to emails, how much time should elapse between response, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I'd say there's experiments going on. You've had Atos who decided they would switch email off on a Friday, I think it was. That was, really celebrated sort of experiments. But guess what? Nobody else has adopted that. The one that I think is quite interesting, I think it's Mercedes-Benz, and they basically will stop their servers sending email outside of working hours or when people are on holiday.
Wow!
So it's the email simply won't go, and I think that's, again, I'd see these things as experiments. Whether we need to be as brutal as closing off the flow. My feeling that the most durable thing is around management and policy and leadership and setting expectations. But, I think the Mercedes-Benz example, if I've got the company right, is an interesting one.
Well, the other topic that got a lot of attention in our discussion boards is once we go into this digital workplace, how do we compensate for that lack of chance conversations around the water cooler, those good conversations that suddenly lead to ideas or exchange of important information? A number of people ask, how do you deal with the loss of those encounters?
Well, I suppose one question is, do you have to lose those conversations? If you give people options of where work happens, do you necessarily, you're not forcing them not to come to a place of work. I mean, Unilever's approach is to give people choice. So some people might choose to come to a physical location every single day or sometimes. So it's not that you're being forced to lose those chance conversations. And I think we're probably also underestimating some of the chance conversations that are happening online. And I think, if you're tuned into this and you're having some interesting little thoughts popping into your head as you're tuning in or when you listen to it later, none of us are physically together. And I'd have to say that's probably a net benefit to you when you have that experience. So I think we often feel that the digital world is going to somehow dilute the physical world, but I think it's actually probably just getting us to think about its importance in a new way. But it is something that I kind of get a little bit torn around as well, because I do visit a lot of organizations, and there's definitely something in the physical presence. But just remember, the digital workplace is operating in your physical environments as well as when you're not in those, if you like, company-owned physical environments.
But interestingly, we have someone who commented, well, our company has digital communities, but they're not utilized because people say they have actual work to do. But yet you've also shown us some great examples today of people who did sort of create places for digital community, for exchange, for sort of conversation. So what was the magic there in the communities where they actually really utilized that and the company comes together around that?
Well, I think it's probably looking for areas of actual genuine interest. So let's say that you're involved in a certain area of drug development, and your colleagues are distributed around different parts of the world, etc. Physical meeting is going to be much harder. So if there is a shared area where you can communicate, converse, etc., it's not just if you like, a distraction from your day job. It actually becomes part of it. So I think looking for some, if you like, groups where there are the seeds of growth and interest are there. And the other thing is, I say, is really slow and steady over time. Don't feel that if the communities are not thriving, or there's only a small number of them that are working at the moment, that over a period of years they won't improve. And they need cultivation. Think of it a bit like gardening. This is not trying to move from a certain way of doing things when the collaboration was generally in physical into doing that in digital fields takes time. But, when you think about it, and it's not that this is not a pro or anti-Facebook comment, but Facebook started, I think they just had their 10-year anniversary. They got 1.7 billion people using it, of whom 1.1 billion use it every day. So without any training, that's a hugely that's an unprecedented level of global collaboration happening on our planet. It might be sharing pictures of people like my mum who, or whatever, but that doesn't really matter. So, shared interest and a platform that works can really make the difference.
So if you build the right thing, they will come. Paul, I want to thank you for a great presentation.
With some cultivation, yes.
Paul, this has been a great discussion, and we've had some really great questions, but I'm afraid that we are out of time today. I want to thank you, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I want to thank BMC for making this discussion possible. This concludes our presentation. Have a great day.